The mountains of Montana held their cold like a secret. Below those peaks,
Train's late.
Weather's turning.
You know her?
Never seen her.
Interesting.
Open the last freight car. Set it down gently.
That thing weighs like iron.
It needs to arrive unopened.
No one knew what was coming behind her.
Someone's coming.
The train was 40 minutes late, which gave Eli Cormack plenty of time to regret the letter. He stood at the far end of the Coldwater Creek platform. If a single-room building with a sagging roof and a wood stove that produced more smoke than heat could be called a platform, with his hat pulled low and his hands shoved into his coat pockets. The handful of other people waiting had the good sense to stand inside near the stove. Eli stayed outside. He needed the cold. It matched his mood, and it kept people from trying to talk to him. The sky was the color of old pewter pressing down close to the ridgeline like it was thinking about snow. It had been thinking about snow for 2 weeks. One of these mornings it was going to stop thinking and just do it. And then everything would shift into the grinding rhythm of a Montana winter, feeding through frozen mud-breaking ice on the water troughs before dawn, watching the cattle huddle and counting heads every night to make sure you hadn't lost one to the cold. He knew that rhythm well. He had been keeping it alone for 3 years. That was why 6 weeks ago, in a moment, he still could not fully account for he had written a letter to the Caldwell Matrimonial Agency in Chicago. He had not wanted to write it. He had sat at the kitchen table for an hour with a blank sheet of paper in front of him, listening to the wind work at the corners of the house and to the very specific silence in the room where May slept. The silence of a 5-year-old who had learned too early not to call out for a mother who wasn't there anymore. He wrote the letter. He kept it plain. He wasn't looking for companionship, he'd said, or softness, or any of the things a man was supposed to want from a wife. He needed someone capable. Someone who understood that a ranch at 4,000 feet in the Montana Territory was not a comfortable life and would not become one. Someone who could help with May manage a household through 6 months of winter and work alongside a man who was not, he admitted, easy to work alongside. The agency had written back with a name: Nora Caldwell of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 26 years old, well-educated, in good health, seeking a fresh start in the West. The phrase fresh start had given him pause. In his experience, people who needed fresh starts had left something behind them, something they weren't entirely honest about. But he had been desperate in the quiet way that doesn't make noise, and he had written back saying she could come. He was regretting that now. The black smoke of the locomotive appeared above the tree line, and then the train arrived with the standard violence of iron and steam groaning to a stop alongside the platform in a cloud of vapor that briefly erased everything. When it cleared, the doors began opening and the passengers stepped down. A traveling salesman with 2 cases, a rancher Eli vaguely recognized from the North Valley, a family of homesteaders with the specific stunned look of people who had expected something different. And then her. She was the last one off, which should have been his first indication that something about this arrangement was not what he had assumed. She stood at the top of the car steps for just a moment before descending, and in that moment, she did something he noticed and couldn't quite explain. She looked up the platform in one direction, then the other. A quick practice scan that was not the ordinary curiosity of arriving somewhere new. It was checking, the way a person checks when they're not certain who might be waiting. Then she came down the steps, and he got his first real look at Nora Caldwell. She was taller than he'd expected, dressed in a dark wool traveling coat that had probably been expensive several seasons ago and was now showing wear at the cuffs and hem. Her hair was dark and pinned up beneath a hat that sat slightly askew, as though she'd adjusted it in a hurry. She carried a small leather bag in one hand and held the rail with the other, and when she reached the platform, she stopped and straightened her coat with a precise, controlled movement, the kind of small physical correction a person made when they were managing something they couldn't otherwise control. She was by any honest accounting striking. That was not what he'd asked for, and not what he'd expected, and it irritated him in a way he couldn't entirely justify. He walked toward her because there was no one else on this platform it could possibly be. "Miss Caldwell," he said. Not a question. She turned, and for just a half second fast enough that he almost missed it, something moved across her face. Relief, maybe. Or the particular exhaustion of a person who had been holding their breath for a very long time and had finally provisionally let it out. "Mr. Cormac." Her voice was steady, a little lower than he'd expected. She put out her hand and he shook it, which was not what most women did. Her grip was firm. "I apologize for the delay. I believe there was some trouble with the track near—" "The delay doesn't matter," he said. "I have a wagon. We should get moving before the weather turns." He saw her absorb the absence of any welcome in that. To her credit, she didn't flinch from it. She nodded. "Of course, I'll need to see to my trunk." He had assumed reasonably he thought that the trunk would be one of the standard travel chests that went in the luggage car. Something two men could manage without difficulty. He followed the station porter toward the freight car, and what he found there stopped him. The thing was massive. It was constructed of dark wood banded with iron at every edge and corner, with iron hasps and hinges, and a lock that looked like it had been designed to survive something considerably worse than ordinary travel. It sat in the luggage car like a small piece of architecture, taking up space with the confidence of an object that had never been asked to apologize for itself. When the porter tried to shift it to test the weight, the man actually swore. "That's going to want 4 men, the porter said, looking at Eli with an expression that contained a question he didn't quite ask out loud. Eli looked at the trunk. Then he looked at Nora, who was standing slightly apart with her leather bag held in both hands and her face entirely composed. She was watching him the way people watch when they're uncertain of their welcome, but have decided not to show it. "What's in it?" he asked. "My things," she said. "Your things?" "Yes." He held her gaze for a moment. She didn't look away, and she didn't elaborate, and something in the particular quality of her stillness told him that this was not a topic she was going to open up simply because he'd frowned at her. He turned back to this porter. "Get me whoever you can." It took 4 men a great deal of effort and 2 near misses before the trunk was loaded onto his wagon. The horses shifted under the weight of it. He did the arithmetic in his head and didn't like the result. Whatever was inside that trunk was not dresses and household linens. He helped Nora up onto the wagon bench, a formality she accepted without comment, and they started out of Coldwater Creek in silence, the wagon tracking deep into the frozen ruts of the main road. She didn't try to fill the silence. He had half expected her to, and was surprised she didn't. Most people treated silence like a problem to be solved. She sat beside him on the bench with her leather bag in her lap and watched the country open up around them as the town fell behind the lodgepole pines, pressing in on either side of the road, the mountains white above the timberline, the sky low and colorless and immense. He watched her watching it, and he couldn't read what she thought of it. Her face gave him very little. "How far is the ranch?" she asked after they had gone perhaps 2 miles. "About an hour in this road," he said. "Less in summer." She nodded. She looked at the mountains again. "You're not from anywhere west of the Alleghenies," he said. "No." A pause. "Philadelphia. The agency said that." "Then you already knew the answer." He hadn't meant it as a question. He'd meant it as a statement of the obvious problem. But she had answered it neutrally rather than taking it as a criticism, and he found that marginally irritating in a way he couldn't entirely justify. "The winters here are hard," he said. "I've been told. Not the way I mean. People tell you they're cold and long and difficult. They don't tell you what it actually does to you. Being inside for days at a time because you can't see your hand in front of your face in the blowing snow. Livestock dying, wood running low, a 5-year-old who doesn't understand why she can't go outside." He kept his eyes on the road. "It breaks people. People who were sure they were prepared." He wasn't trying to frighten her. He was trying to give her an accurate picture. It seemed like the honest thing to do. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What broke the last person?" He felt that land. He hadn't expected it. "The winter," he said, because it was the shortest version of a truth that was much longer and not something he was going to explain to a woman he had met 40 minutes ago. "Just the winter." She didn't press it. She looked at her hands resting on the leather bag, then looked back out at the road. They traveled the rest of the way to the ranch in a silence that had changed slightly, the way a room changes when someone has said something true in it. May was waiting on the porch. She had been told twice to wait inside where it was warm, and had agreed both times with the particular sincerity of a 5-year-old who has no intention of complying. She was standing on the top porch step in her coat, her red scarf wound twice around her neck, her dark eyes fixed on the approaching wagon with an intensity that made Eli's chest do something complicated. She was the only good thing he had managed in the last 3 years. Maybe longer than that. He pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard and got down. Before he could say a word to May, she had already launched herself off the step, not toward him, which was what he'd have expected, but toward the woman on the wagon bench who was just beginning to climb down. "Are you her?" May demanded. "Are you the one coming to live with us?" Nora had one hand on the wagon side and one foot on the wheel spoke, and she stopped mid-descent to look at the child addressing her. Something in her face shifted in a way Eli had not yet seen. The composed mask cracked sideways for just a moment, and what came through it was not sentimentality exactly, but something genuine and slightly unguarded. "I am," she said. "Are you May? Papa said you were coming from far away." May studied her with the complete absence of social filtering that belongs exclusively to small children. "You're pretty. Is that your trunk? It's very big. What's in it?" "May." Eli's voice carried the warning note. "It's all right," Nora said. She stepped down from the wagon and crouched to May's level in a single easy motion. There was something practiced about it, the way you crouch when you're accustomed to speaking with children. "The trunk has some things I've kept for a long time. Important things." "Like what?" May asked. "I'll show you someday," Nora said, "when the time is right." May considered this with great seriousness. Then she said, "Okay," and took Nora's hand with the absolute trust that children extend and adults spend their whole lives learning not to, and led her toward the front door of the house as though they had always known each other. Eli stood in the yard and watched this happen. He felt something move through him that he didn't have a clean name for. The house was what it was. He kept it functional and not much more. Clean enough, warm enough, practical in every way it needed to be. The few decorative touches his wife Catherine had added were long gone. Put away somewhere he didn't have to look at them, replaced by the spare logic of a man who lived alone with a small child and had no patience for anything that didn't serve a purpose. He watched Nora take it in when she walked through the door. Watched her read the rooms the way a perceptive person reads a space. The kitchen with its heavy iron stove. The main room with its worn furniture arranged around warmth rather than conversation. The single window with its view of the barn. The shelf above the fireplace with its 3 books and May's collection of smooth stones and one small cloth doll with button eyes. She didn't make any comment about the house, didn't arrange her features into appreciation, or say anything polite and hollow about it being cozy or having good bones. She walked through it and she looked. And when she came back to the kitchen, she said, "What time does she eat supper?" 6, he said, "when she'll cooperate." "What is she like about anything with sweetness in it?" "She'll eat around vegetables if she can manage it." Nora nodded like she was filing this away. "I'll start learning the kitchen tomorrow. Tonight I don't want to get in your way." He hadn't expected that kind of restraint. Most people in a new situation tried to be useful immediately to establish themselves and usually made more trouble than they solved. "That's fine," he said. She nodded and moved toward the small room off the kitchen that he'd told her in the letter would be hers. At the door she paused. "The trunk," she said. "I'll need it brought in before tonight." "I'll get it. It needs to stay in my room." She said it evenly without force, but with a precision that made clear this was not a point of preference but a point of requirement. "I'll sleep better knowing it's there." He looked at her. She looked back. "All right," he said. She went into the room and closed the door, and he stood in the kitchen for a moment in the particular silence of a house that had recently added a person to it and hadn't quite settled around the addition yet. Then he got his coat and went outside to drag the trunk in. The first week was what he'd expected, and also nothing like what he'd expected. What he'd expected was difficulty. He had assumed she wouldn't know how to do things, and she did not any of the specific physical things that running a frontier ranch required, not the rhythm of it, not the brute labor of keeping alive in November at elevation with bad weather coming. He had expected to have to show her things. He did. What he hadn't expected was the quality of her attention when he did. He showed her how to handle the cook stove, the particular temperament of it, the way it needed to be managed rather than simply operated. She listened with the complete focus of someone learning a foreign language who knows their survival depends on getting it right. She made a mistake the next morning that filled the kitchen with smoke. She didn't apologize for it or make excuses. She opened the door, studied what had gone wrong, and didn't make the same mistake again. He showed her the chickens and the cow. The cow's name was Bessie, and her temperament was consistently uncharitable. She kicked at Nora twice the first morning. Most people would have flinched back and been timid with the animal after that. Nora stood there for a moment, seemed to make some internal decision, and went back to the task with the same patience she'd been using before. Bessie didn't kick a third time. On the fourth morning, he watched Nora stand up from the milking stool, look Bessie directly in the face, and say quietly and without any particular heat, "We can keep doing this, or you can decide we're done with it. Either way, I'm not leaving." Bessie swung her big head and looked at the wall. Nora sat back down and finished the milking without further incident. Eli had to leave the barn for a moment. He stood outside in the cold with his hand over his mouth and waited until he was sure his face was back to where it needed to be before going back in. "She's coming around," he said. "She doesn't have a choice," Nora said, which was not strictly true, but he didn't say so. She was a quick study in the ways that mattered, and she made the kinds of mistakes that people made when they were genuinely trying rather than the kinds that came from not paying attention. The distinction was visible if you knew what to look for, and Eli had spent enough years working alongside people in difficult conditions to know the difference. She didn't protect herself from the work. Most people new to a hard thing kept something in reserve, some internal distance between themselves and the task that would allow them to retreat without too much lost if it proved beyond them. Nora didn't do that. She went at each new thing completely, and when it beat her, she looked at why and went at it again. The lesson about splitting wood came in the second week when he found her in the yard with the hatchet and a round of knotted oak that would have given an experienced man pause. She'd been at it for 20 minutes by the look of the wood, and the hatchet had glanced off a knotted section and taken a piece of bark clean off the stump 6 inches from her boot. He'd been watching from the porch. He came down, and she was standing there looking at the hatchet and at the stump and at her boot, and her face had the specific expression of someone who had just understood a thing in their body that they'd only understood in their head before. "Give me that," he said, not meaning it as harshly as it came out. She gave him the hatchet. She watched him work for a moment. "Show me again," she said. "I want to see what I'm doing wrong." He looked at her. She was serious and not making it about pride or embarrassment. She was just asking because she wanted to know. Something about that stripped away the irritation completely. He handed her the hatchet back, adjusted her grip and her stance with a few short directions, and let her try again. The second strike was better. The third split the round clean. She looked at the split wood with an expression that was not triumph exactly, but something quieter and more durable. Again, she said, they spent an hour at it. She didn't mention being tired or cold, and she wasn't proficient by the end, but she was better, and she'd built more wood than she'd split going in. He split the difficult rounds himself, and she watched what he did differently and then tried again. "Why does it matter this much to you?" he asked when they were stacking the finished wood. It wasn't an accusation. He was genuinely curious. She thought about it before she answered, which she always did. "Because everything I don't know how to do here is something I depend on you for." She set a piece of wood down and picked up another. "I need to be able to do things myself. That matters to me." He thought about that while they finished the stack. He thought about what it meant, the specific flavor of independence she was describing. The need to not be beholden to any single person for survival. That wasn't just frontier practicality. That was something someone had learned the hard way. The need to be capable of going it alone, even when you weren't going it alone. He didn't pursue it, but he heard it. The neighbors came on the fourth day. Edna and Garrett Briggs from the next spread over 6 miles east, which counted as close out here. They came with a covered dish in the transparent excuse of welcoming Nora, which was to say they came to look at her. Edna was not a malicious woman, but she had a face that filtered every new thing through a permanent skepticism, and she ran that filter over Nora with the thoroughness of a customs inspector. "You're from Philadelphia," Edna said, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee. It had the sound of an accusation. "I am," Nora said. Long way to come for a ranch in Montana. It is. Most women who come out from the East. Edna paused in the careful way of someone selecting a word that communicates meaning without technically being rude. Find it's not quite what they'd hoped. I haven't hoped for anything in particular, Nora said. I've only planned to be useful. Edna looked at her. Garrett looked at the table. Eli, standing at the stove and pretending to be occupied with it, heard something in the exchange that Edna had missed. Not a rebuke exactly, but a quiet closing of a door on a line of conversation that wasn't going anywhere. Nora was willing to go. After they left, Edna said to her husband on the road home, though she didn't know Eli could still hear across the cold in the distance, "A refined woman like that coming all the way out here makes no sense. Something she's not saying." Edna wasn't wrong. Eli knew she wasn't wrong. He thought the same thing since the moment he watched Nora scan that train platform like she was expecting pursuit. He just didn't yet know what to do with the knowledge. It was the doll that got to him. May had a cloth doll she'd had since she was 2, one of the few things left over from a time Eli didn't like to think about. It was not a fancy thing handmade with uneven stitching and button eyes that didn't quite match. But May treated it with the specific reverence children extend to objects that have come to stand for something larger than themselves. On the 8th day of Nora's presence in the house, the doll caught on a loose nail in the wall by May's bed. When May pulled it free, the seam along one arm tore open badly. The stuffing dried grass and scraps began leaking out. Eli heard May crying from the barn and came in to find her in the main room with the doll in her hands and the kind of grief on her face that only children can show cleanly. The whole of it, right there on the surface, nothing held back. He went to her and held her and said the things he knew to say, that it could be fixed, that it would be all right. But the truth was he had no idea how to fix a cloth doll, and he owned nothing that resembled sewing supplies. Nora came in from outside, stopped when she saw May, and took in the situation in a single glance. "May I look?" she asked. May, still crying, held out the doll. Nora took it, turned it over carefully, studied the torn seam. "I can fix this," she said. "How?" May asked. The crying had dropped to hitching breaths. "I have something in my trunk. Come with me." He watched them go to Nora's room together, May's small hand in Nora's, both of them disappearing through the door. He heard the trunk's heavy lid being opened, the particular sound of iron hinges moving. He heard May say something he couldn't make out. And then he heard May say, "Oh," in the way that means a child has been shown something remarkable. He didn't follow them. He stood in the main room and waited. 40 minutes later, they came back out. May was carrying the doll repaired. The seam where the tear had been was now stitched with a thread that caught the firelight, golden bright against the dull cloth, visible and intentional rather than hidden. "She's stronger there now," May told him with complete conviction. Nora said that what gets mended with love grows stronger than it was before. Eli looked at his daughter's face. Then he looked at Nora, who was standing in the doorway of her room with her arms at her sides and her expression carefully neutral. She was watching him the way people watch when they're uncertain of their welcome. He didn't know what to say, which was not a familiar condition for him. "That's good, May," he said, which was not adequate but was what he had. Then he went back out to the barn because he needed somewhere to put the thing that was happening in his chest, and the barn was the only place he knew to take it. That same evening, the 8th evening of Nora's time in the house, he came in late from checking the water troughs and found her at the kitchen table writing a letter. She heard him come in, and her hand moved across the paper with a speed that covered what she'd been writing. Then she folded it and held it in her lap and looked at him with that composed face. "I'm not going to read your mail," he said. "I know," she said, but she kept the letter folded in her hand until he'd gotten his cup and left the room. He wasn't going to press. It wasn't his business. He had told her she could stay or leave on her own terms, and that meant her private business was her private business. Whatever she was hiding in that trunk, whatever she left behind in Philadelphia, whatever made her scan train platforms and fold letters when unexpected company arrived, none of it had so far been his problem. But the next morning he found it. He came through the front hall at first light on his way to the kitchen, and there it was on the floor near the base of the door, a plain envelope. No return address, no postmark. Someone had slipped it under the door from outside. He picked it up and looked at it for a moment. Nora's name on the front written in a tight, forward-leaning hand he didn't recognize. He set it on the kitchen table and started the stove. When Nora came in, she saw it before he said a word. She stopped in the middle of the kitchen and looked at the envelope from across the room. And her face did not show surprise. It showed the opposite of surprise. It showed the expression of someone who has been waiting for something and has now watched it arrive exactly where they feared it would. She crossed the room, picked up the envelope, and went to her room. He heard the trunk's heavy lid open, then close. He made breakfast. He got May fed and out to the yard with her coat and her mittens. He was at the table with his second cup of coffee when Nora came back out. She sat down across from him and put the letter face down on the table. She looked at him with the expression of someone who has received information they were half expecting and is now deciding what to do with the weight of it. "Someone knows I'm here," she said. He waited. "I want you to understand that this may create difficulty for you." She said it plainly, not dramatically, the way you state a fact that needs to be stated regardless of how it lands. "If you want me to leave before it does, I'll understand that. I think that's a fair thing to offer you." He looked at her across the table. He looked at the letter lying face down between them. He thought about the scan she'd made on the train platform. He thought about the trunk that 4 men could barely lift. He thought about May's doll with the golden thread catching the firelight. "I'm not going to tell you to leave," he said. She waited for the rest of it. "Whatever comes," he said, "we'll handle it. But if you want to tell me what it is, I think maybe it's time." She looked at the letter. She looked at the window. Outside, the first real snow of November was beginning. Not the serious kind, not yet, just the land beginning to make its position on the matter clear. "Not tonight," she said, "but soon." And then quieter, "I'll tell you soon." He nodded. He refilled his coffee. She sat at the table a while longer, not talking, but not leaving either, and outside the snow came down without hurry. He thought about what she'd said and what she hadn't said. He thought about the specific kind of woman who scans a train platform before descending, who carries a trunk so heavy it takes 4 men who teaches a 5-year-old that what gets mended with love grows stronger than it was before. He realized as resistant to caring about the outcome as he'd have liked to be. That was the thing that kept him awake that night, listening to the wind find the gaps in the window frame and to the slow, warm creak of the house settling against the cold. 3 years of keeping this place running alone had taught him a great deal about what he could manage without. He had been methodical about it, almost scientific, stripping away everything that wasn't necessary, building a life that was austere and functional and entirely under his control. What he had not planned for was the particular sound the house made now when all the people in it were simply at rest. It was not the empty quiet of 3 years spent listening for a child's breathing in the dark and hearing only the wind. It was something else, something he didn't have a word for yet, but that he recognized the way you recognize a smell from a long time ago before you can name where it comes from. 3 days later, the second letter came. He found it at 4:30 in the morning when he came through the hall to the kitchen. Same envelope. Same tight, forward-leaning handwriting. Nora's name on the outside. He held it for a long moment in the dark hallway, feeling the weight of it, which was almost nothing, just paper and ink, and also not nothing at all. He set it on the kitchen table, started the stove, and went out to the barn. When he came back, she was already in the kitchen. She was wearing the coat she'd arrived in, which was not the right coat for this kind of cold, a fact he'd been thinking about for a week without saying anything, and she was standing at the kitchen window with her coffee in both hands. She saw the letter on the table before he'd said a word. She went still the way an animal goes still. "Same hand," he said. She set down her coffee. She picked up the letter and turned it over, and something moved through her jaw, a tightening barely visible but visible to him now, because he'd been watching her long enough to read the small things. She opened it, she read it. He watched her face and saw nothing useful. She had gone into the composure fully now, the way she went into the cold completely and without reservation. She folded it and looked at him. "I'm going to tell you," she said. "Tonight after May is in bed. All of it." She paused. "You should know everything before—" She stopped. "Before what?" he asked. She looked at the window. The sky was barely lightening, gray going to pale gray. Outside, the snow was beginning again, a light fall, patient and indifferent the way Montana prepared itself for what was coming next. "Before it gets worse," she said, "and it will get worse." He nodded. He poured his coffee and sat down across from her, and they were quiet together in the morning kitchen, which was not an uncomfortable silence anymore. It was the silence of two people who had been in each other's company long enough to not need noise to fill the space between them. May woke up in the next room and called out for her mittens, which she had lost somewhere between the bed and the floor, which was where she lost most things. Nora stood up and went to help her find them. Eli sat with his coffee and listened to the sounds of the house starting its day. May's voice, Nora's lower one, answering it, the particular warmth of two people navigating a shared morning without difficulty. He thought about it all day. He split wood and thought about it. He repaired a section of fence along the south pasture and thought about it. He checked the cattle and came back and thought about it while he was doing 3 other things. He was not a man who did well with not knowing. He didn't panic, but the not knowing lodged somewhere uncomfortable and stayed there. Whatever Nora Caldwell or whoever she actually was carrying in that letter and in that trunk, and in the particular quality of her watchfulness, it was real. And it was going to arrive at his door, whether he was ready for it or not. At supper, May talked about a bird she'd seen at the kitchen window, and whether birds got cold the way people got cold, and why birds didn't fall off branches when they slept. This led to a 10-minute discussion of bird feet that Nora handled with complete seriousness and apparent genuine interest, providing detail that suggested she had either studied the subject or had the rare gift of making things up so convincingly they became true. Eli sat at that table and watched the two of them. He thought about how quickly a thing could matter that you hadn't planned on mattering. He got May to bed. It took longer than usual. She wanted 3 stories and claimed through most of the third one that she wasn't tired and then was deeply asleep before he finished the last sentence. He stood over her for a moment in the dark, listening to her breathe. Then he went back out to the main room. Nora had moved the 2 chairs to face the fireplace, which was different from how they usually sat. She was already in one of them, her hands in her lap, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked like she was genuinely dreading what came next. He sat down in the other chair. He waited. "My name is Nora Ashton," she said. She said it in a flat, careful voice, like a person quoting a document. "Caldwell was my mother's family name. I took it because no one would look for it." He kept his face still and let her continue. "My father was Edmund Ashton." She said the name the same way, careful, controlled. "He owned Ashton Industrial in Philadelphia. Steel mills mostly, some railway supply contracts. By the time he died last March, the business was worth somewhere between $2 and $3 million. She paused. "He had one surviving child, me, and he left everything to me outright, which was not what anyone else expected, and not what certain people were willing to accept." The fire snapped. Outside, the snow was coming down in earnest now. "My father's brother, my Uncle Warren Ashton, had been managing the business for the last 2 years while my father was ill. Warren believed that managing the business gave him a claim on it. He and his son, my cousin Brett, made their position clear within a week of the funeral. Brett came to the house with a lawyer, not my lawyer, his, in a document that had allegedly been signed by my father 3 weeks before his death, amending his will to give controlling interest in the company to Warren." She looked at the fire. "I'd never seen it. Neither had my father's attorney, Mr. Pemberton Graves, who had drafted the original will. The signature was..." She pressed her lips together. "It was close, but it wasn't right. I knew my father's signature, and that wasn't it. I told him so." "What happened then?" "Brett told me the document was legally valid and that if I contested it publicly, I would find myself in circumstances I wouldn't enjoy." She said it without drama, simply recounting. I understood what he meant. There were other documents that Brett had access to, things Warren had been in the business files long enough to manipulate, that could be made to look as though I had done things I hadn't done. Financial irregularities, that sort of thing. He was telling me he could destroy my reputation before any court looked at his father's forged document. Eli thought about this. Why not go to the authorities? Because Warren had a relationship with the city magistrate that predated my father's illness by 15 years. And because Brett's document had 2 witnesses, whose names I recognized, men Warren had employed for the specific purpose of being useful in situations like this. She looked at him. "I had my father's real attorney, and I had the truth. And neither of those things was going to be enough in a courtroom in Philadelphia in the spring of 1893, when my uncle had already spent 6 months making friends with the people who decided what was true. Eli was quiet for a moment. "The trunk," he said. "The trunk." She nodded. "Pemberton Graves helped me. He gathered everything, the original will correspondence between my father and the attorney that established his intentions clearly, gold certificates from accounts Warren didn't know existed, other documents that proved the business was mine and mine alone. We put it all in the trunk with enough cash to survive for a year. Graves sealed it. I took it and I left. Why a matrimonial arrangement? Because it was the fastest way to disappear into a name that wasn't mine, in a place that wasn't on any map that Brett Ashton would think to check. She said it simply. I wasn't planning to deceive you past what was necessary. I was going to tell you. I just needed to know first whether I was... She stopped. Whether you were safe here, he said. She looked at him. Yes. The fire settled. The wind moved around the north corner of the house looking for the gaps. He could feel the temperature dropping through the walls. The letters, he said. What do they say? She picked up the one she'd brought out with her. This one says that a man named Dade Mercer, that's Brett's name for a hired man he uses for difficult work, has been seen in Coldwater Creek asking about a woman traveling alone with heavy luggage. He was asking at the station. She set it down. The first letter was a warning that Mercer had lost my trail at Chicago. This one is telling me he's found it again. Who's writing to warn you? Graves, my father's attorney. He's been watching for movement. A pause. He's the only person in Philadelphia who knows where I am. Eli looked at the fire for a while. He was doing the mathematics of it, the shape of the problem, the weight of what she'd just placed in the room between them. A hired man in Coldwater Creek asking questions. A woman in his house with documents worth millions. A Montana winter that would trap everyone in place for months regardless of what anyone wanted. He thought about a 5-year-old who had taken this woman's hand at the bottom of a wagon step as though she'd been waiting for her specifically. He thought about golden thread catching firelight on a repaired seam. All right, he said. She looked at him. That's all. What else do you want me to say? I've put you in danger, she said. I've done it by being here, and I knew I was doing it, and I did it anyway because I was out of options. She said it directly without asking him to feel anything about it. You're entitled to be angry. I'm not angry. He looked at the fire and then at her. I'm thinking about how to handle it. She was quiet for a moment. Why aren't you angry? He thought about it honestly, the way she always seemed to ask things that deserved honest answers. Because I believe you, he said, and because you got up before dawn every morning this week and didn't complain once. Because you sat with May over that doll for 40 minutes and used the best thread you had. He paused. People in trouble who are also decent people don't stop being decent people just because they're in trouble. That's been my experience. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was complicated in a way he didn't try to read. Then she looked at the fire. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, he said. Tell me everything about this man Mercer so I know what I'm dealing with. And she told him. And outside the snow kept falling, patient and indifferent and entirely without mercy, the way Montana settled in when it had decided the season had truly begun. She told him everything she knew about Dade Mercer, which was not as much as she would have liked and considerably more than was comfortable to sit with in a kitchen in Montana in November. Mercer was 40 or so, according to what Graves had been able to gather. A man who worked in the specific territory between a private investigator and something less polite. Brett Ashton had used him before for things that required discretion and a tolerance for the kind of work that didn't get written down in formal agreements. He was methodical. He didn't make loud moves. He had tracked Nora from Philadelphia to Chicago to St. Louis to the agency's placement files, and from there to Coldwater Creek, a process that had taken him 6 months and suggested both patience and resources that didn't come cheap. He won't come to the property directly, Nora said. That's not how he works. He'll gather information first, figure out what he's dealing with. Then he'll decide whether to approach me himself or go back to Brett and report the location and let Brett decide the next step. What would the next step be? Legal action most likely. Brett's lawyer filing documents in a Montana court claiming I've absconded with company property. She said it carefully. The trunk, the documents, they'd call it theft. Could they make that stick? Not ultimately. Graves would go to court with the original will and the correspondence, and it would eventually come out right. But eventually is the problem. She looked at her hands. Months, possibly longer. And during that time, I would be a contested person, someone a court was examining, someone whose reliability and character was being argued over by lawyers. A pause. And you would be the man who harbored her. Eli had already thought through that part on his way home from the barn. He'd gotten through all the ways it could complicate his life and come out the other side, which was where he usually ended up with things that were already decided. I know an attorney in Coldwater Creek, he said. Thaddeus Slocum. He's honest, which is rarer than it should be. And I have a standing relationship with Judge Aldous Holt in Billings. He rode out here 2 years ago to settle a land dispute in my favor, and he doesn't like being maneuvered. We should talk to Slocum. She looked at him the way people look when someone has done something they didn't expect. What, he said. You said we. Did I? Yes. He picked up his coffee, which had gone cold. I meant it. They sat there a while longer without talking. The fire had burned down to coals that glowed orange in the dark, and outside the storm was building from the northwest. Not tonight's storm, but the weather that was accumulating somewhere. He couldn't yet see that would arrive in its own time, regardless of whether anyone was ready for it. He was not, he realized, as indifferent to the outcome as he'd planned to be. That thought stayed with him through the night and into the days that followed. Nora moved through the house and the work with the same focused attention she'd had since the beginning, except that now there was something beneath it, a layer of watchfulness that hadn't been visible before, or that he hadn't been looking for. She checked the window when she heard horses on the road. She paused when a sound came from outside that she couldn't immediately place. She was doing it carefully enough that May didn't notice. But Eli noticed, and he let it go because he had said when she was ready, and he meant it. What he didn't do was pretend the situation wasn't accumulating weight. He did his thinking in the places he'd always done it out, in the work in the cold, in the barn before first light, when it was just him and the animals in the dark. He thought about the forward-leaning handwriting on those folded envelopes. He thought about a woman who had left a city and a fortune and an entire identity behind and ended up on his porch in November. He thought about what it cost a person to do that. The particular courage or desperation or both that it required. He thought about May's hand and Nora's as they walked through the front door that first afternoon. He went into Coldwater Creek on a Thursday and found Thaddeus Slocum in his office above the hardware store, a lean, direct man in his late 40s who had come to Montana from Virginia 15 years ago for reasons he'd never felt the need to explain, and who had built a reputation in the valley for being one of the few lawyers in the territory who would tell you something you didn't want to hear, rather than something that ran up his hours. Eli told him everything. He left nothing out because Slocum couldn't help with incomplete information, and incomplete information in a legal matter was usually more dangerous than no information at all. Slocum listened without interrupting. When it was done, he was quiet for a moment, turning a pen over in his fingers. Her father's attorney in Philadelphia, he said. She trusts him completely. She trusts him with her location, Eli said, which is the most valuable thing she has right now. She'll need to contact him by wire, not letter. Letters take too long on a route that Mercer may be watching. Slocum set down the pen. If the original will and the supporting correspondence are as solid as she believes the forged document is a problem Brett Ashton can manage in Philadelphia, but can't easily export to a Montana court without it being examined more carefully than he'd like. Distance works in his favor and in hers both. He paused. The question is what Mercer is here to do. If he's here to report her location, that gives you time. If he's here for something more direct. Like what? Eli said, though he already had a fair idea. The trunk, Slocum said plainly. If Brett can get his hands on those documents before a Montana court has seen them, the original will disappear, and all that's left is his forged version and his witnesses. That's a considerably cleaner outcome for him than a court fight. Eli sat with that for a moment. He had been thinking about the trunk as something to protect. He hadn't been thinking carefully enough about it as a target, What do I do about Mercer directly? He's in town asking questions. Asking questions isn't illegal. You can't run him off for that. Slocum leaned back in his chair. But if he comes onto your property without an invitation, that's a different matter. And out here, that matter has a fairly direct resolution that doesn't require my involvement. He said it without any particular inflection. Get the trunk moved, not somewhere clever, somewhere that's obvious to you, but not to a man who's been in the county for 2 weeks. And get a wire to Philadelphia today. Eli sent the wire from the telegraph office on his way to the general store. He kept it short using the name and the language Nora had given him. He paid the operator and went to get the supplies. It was at the general store that he saw Mercer. He didn't know it was Mercer at first. There was a man at the counter when he came in medium height, unremarkable, in the way that men who work at being unremarkable are unremarkable, dressed in practical town clothes that were neither frontier nor city. He was buying tobacco and talking to the storekeeper, Ben Aldrich, in the easy manner of a man who was simply passing through and had no particular angle. Eli came in and nodded to Ben and took his list to the far end of the counter. The man looked at him just a glance ordinary, the way you look at anyone who enters a space you're in. Eli looked back just as ordinary and turned to his list. He was aware of the man in his peripheral vision the way he was aware of weather. Not focused on it, tracking it. Then Ben said in the helpful way that Ben always said things without understanding their consequences. You said you were asking about the Cormack place. That's Eli Cormack right there. Eli kept his face level and turned. The man's expression didn't change. He was good, this one. But he adjusted slightly, a subtle recalibration, like a navigator correcting course. He put out his hand. Mr. Cormack, name's Harlan Webb. I'm passing through from Billings, and I heard you might have a parcel of land on the south side worth knowing about. I represent some interests looking to expand their cattle operation. It was a smooth lie told without hesitation, with the right kind of casual confidence. Eli shook the hand and looked at the man and read what he could. Steady eyes, the particular physical stillness of someone in control of themselves. Hands that had work in them, but not the specific calluses of a man who'd spent his life with cattle or rope. I don't have land for sale, Eli said. Didn't think you necessarily did, just wanted to ask. The easy smile. The valley is beautiful country. I can see why people settle here. It's cold country, Eli said. Not everyone handles that. Oh, I don't mind the cold. The smile again. I go where the work takes me. Eli looked at him for one more moment. Then he turned back to his list and let Ben fill the order. He heard Mercer say a pleasant goodbye to Ben and leave the store. He stood at that counter with his list in his hand and thought carefully about what he'd just seen. Mercer had been prepared for the encounter. The land sale story was a cover he'd been carrying specifically in case he ran into Eli directly. He'd used it without hesitation, which meant he'd prepared it, which meant he'd known there was a reasonable chance Eli would be here. He had been watching the ranch, possibly for days. Eli finished his order, loaded the wagon, and drove home with that information sitting in his chest like a stone. He told Nora that evening after May was in bed. He told it plainly what Mercer looked like, what he'd said, how he'd handled the encounter. He watched her face while he talked and saw her absorb it with the specific quality of stillness he now recognized as her processing something she'd already half expected. He knows where we are, she said. He's known for a while the station, the letters. He's been gathering information. Eli paused. Slocum thinks he might be here for the documents, not just to report your location. Her eyes went to the door of her room. We need to move the trunk, Eli said. Tonight. Where the root cellar. There's a section at the back behind the shelving that Garrett Briggs helped me build 3 years ago. He and I are the only 2 people who know about it. We put it in because I had a run-in with some men over a land dispute and needed somewhere to keep important papers. It's dry and it's not visible even if you know the cellar exists. She was quiet for a moment. And the legal side, Slocum is sending a wire to Judge Holt in Billings tomorrow morning outlining the situation from your side before Brett can file anything from back east. Holt isn't a perfect man, but he's a fair one. He'll want to hear both sides before he acts on anything coming from out of territory. He looked at her. We have a window, but we have to move the trunk tonight. Mercer won't move in the dark in unfamiliar country in December. Whatever he does in daylight when he can see what he's working with. She stood up and went to her room without another word. He heard the trunk lid open and heard her moving through things, not packing, but organizing, the sound of papers being carefully sorted. When she came back out, she had a leather satchel he hadn't seen before, thick with documents. "The most important things come with me," she said. "The rest goes in the cellar with the trunk." Smart. Moving the trunk in the dark was hard physical work that took longer than it should have and required both of them the entire time. Nora pulled her share without being asked and without complaint, and they got it into the root cellar and behind the shelving and covered before midnight. She organized the hidden satchel beside it with the care of someone who had been thinking about this specific arrangement for a long time. When they came back inside, she sat down at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the surface and looked at them. He made coffee. He set a cup in front of her and sat down across from her and didn't say anything, because sometimes the right thing was to not say anything. After a while, she said, "Thank you. You keep thanking me," he said. "You keep doing things worth thanking." He drank his coffee. Outside, the wind had begun picking up from the northwest, the direction it came from, when something real was building. 3 nights after the trunk was moved, Eli woke at 2 in the morning to a sound he couldn't immediately place. Not the horses, not the wind finding the usual gaps in the eaves. Something deliberate, careful, and quiet and patient in a way that natural things were not. He lay still for a moment, reading it, the way a man reads something he can't quite see, processing it through memory and instinct before understanding arrived. Then he got up without lighting the lamp. He moved through the dark house to the hall and stood with his back to the wall and listened. The sound came from the north side of the house, from the direction of the small bedroom. Nora's room. He went to the window of the main room and looked out at the side yard, keeping himself back from the glass. There was a figure at the side of the house, at the window of the small bedroom, standing close to the wall, doing something careful and unhurried with the window frame, not forcing it, trying it. The way a man tries a thing when he doesn't want to make noise. Eli got his coat from the peg by the back door and took his rifle from above the kitchen door frame. He went out the back and came around the north side of the house, slowly keeping to the shadow of the wall. By the time he came around the corner, the figure was already moving away. Not running, walking the careful, measured pace of a man who knows that running announces guilt. He was heading toward the tree line at the edge of the property. Eli watched him go until the darkness took him completely. Then he stood in the cold for a long moment and looked at Nora's window. The latch had been tried. The window had held. He went back inside, moved quietly down the hall, and checked the latch from inside her room without waking her. It was sound. He stood there for a moment in the dark, listening to her breathe, and felt something settle hard and cold in his chest that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but was in the neighborhood of both. He went back to bed. In the morning, he said nothing about it to Nora immediately. He waited until May was out in the yard with the chickens, and then he told her plainly what had happened. She was still for a long moment. "He was trying to get into the room where the trunk was," she said. "Before we moved it, yes." She looked at the table. "If we hadn't moved it that night—" "We did," he said. "That's what matters." She looked at him. Something moved across her face that she didn't fully control. Not fear exactly, but the recognition of how close a thing had come. Then she put it away in the place where she put things she couldn't afford to carry on the surface. "What do we do now?" she said. "I go into town," he said. "I talk to Slocum. And the next time Mercer comes onto this property, it won't be at a window." May got sick at the end of November, not seriously as it turned out, but for 2 days her fever ran high enough to make the distinction feel irrelevant. Nora was good with sick children in a way that was not performed. It was not trained efficiency or careful attention to duty. It was something that looked native to her, like a person who had done this before for someone she cared about. She kept track of the fever with a closeness that Eli recognized as real anxiety, not managed concern. She made broth from things she found in the kitchen and got May to drink it by turning it into a story about a bear who needed soup to be brave enough to face winter. She sat with May in the dark when the child couldn't sleep, talking quietly, the words too low for Eli to catch from the doorway, only the tone of them steady and unhurried, and certain the voice of someone telling a child that the world was still in its right order and would remain so. He sat up with them both, though Nora hadn't asked him to, and seemed faintly surprised when she came out for water at midnight and found him in the chair by the fireplace awake. "The fever's down," she said. "She's sleeping." He nodded. She stood in the doorway between the main room and the hall holding the water glass. She was in the clothes she'd been in all day, not having stopped to change or rest, and she looked tired in a way that her face didn't usually allow the particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding a vigil and is only now letting the vigilance ease. "She called me Mama," she said. She said it carefully, the way you say something you're still deciding what to do with. When she was half asleep, she was reaching for her mother, and then she looked at me and she said it, and then she was asleep again. Eli looked at the fire. He didn't say anything for a moment because he was working out what to say and wanted to say it right. "She doesn't remember Catherine," he said. "Not really. She was 2 when Catherine died. She knows there was a mother. It's more an idea to her than a memory. The shape of a thing rather than the thing itself." Nora was quiet. "She wasn't confused," he said. "She wasn't mixing you up with someone else." He heard Nora exhale slowly. He didn't look at her face because this seemed like a moment she was entitled to have in private, even in a shared room. Some things a person needed to carry by themselves for a little while before they could set them down. "You should get some sleep," she said after a while. "I'll sit with her a little longer." He didn't argue. He went to bed. Through the wall, he heard her settle into the chair beside May's bed, and after a while he heard nothing, which meant May was sleeping and Nora was watching. And the house was quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet for 3 years. Not the empty quiet of absence, but the particular quality of silence that fills a place when the people in it are simply at rest. That difference he was finding was harder to be indifferent to than he'd expected. 3 days after May recovered, Edna Briggs began talking. Eli heard about it from Garrett, who came by on a Saturday with a piece of equipment he'd borrowed and stayed for coffee in the way that meant he had something to say and was working up to saying it. Nora was out with May at the near pasture practicing the fence check Eli had been teaching her. Garrett seemed relieved by this. "Edna's been asking around," Garrett said to his coffee cup, about Miss Caldwell. She wrote her sister and Helena. Her sister couldn't find any family by the name Caldwell in the Philadelphia circles Edna thought a woman like that would come from." Eli was quiet. "Edna's saying it in the wrong way is the thing," Garrett continued. "She's not saying it as a possibility. She's saying it as a fact, that the woman is hiding something, that she's running from something, and she's saying it to people who will pass it along." He looked uncomfortable. "Seems unfair is all I wanted to tell you. The woman works hard and she treats your little girl right. Edna's got no actual evidence of anything." "Thank you, Garrett," Eli said. He meant it. Garrett finished his coffee and left. And Eli sat with what he'd said. He knew the pattern of this. A small community in the frozen middle of nowhere, a winter coming that would keep everyone inside and irritable for months, and a newcomer who kept her own counsel. Suspicion was how people out here managed the things they couldn't explain. And suspicion left alone became something worse, the kind of thing that hardened into reputation before the truth ever got a chance to catch up. He thought about Nora moving through the work every morning before first light. He thought about the way she answered May's questions, all of them fully, without condescension, as though the child's curiosity was a thing worth taking seriously. He thought about her standing in the cold outside the barn in his old sheepskin coat that swallowed her hands doing the feeding without being asked, because the work needed doing and she was there. He made a decision. The following Tuesday, he drove to the Briggs place on the way back from the south pasture. Edna was in the yard when he pulled up, and she came toward him with the particular expression of a woman who knows a conversation is coming and is preparing her position. He didn't give her time to prepare. "Edna," he said, staying up on the wagon, "I've heard what you've been saying about Nora Caldwell. I'm asking you to stop." Edna's chin went up. "I've only been saying what's true. Nobody knows who she walked into a blizzard with a rope around her waist to find me when I was turned around in the north field." He said it evenly, not angry, just factual. "She sits up with my daughter when May is sick. She does the morning feeding before I'm out of the barn. She does the work without being asked and without complaint, and she has done it every single morning since she arrived." He looked at Edna steadily. "Whatever you don't know about where she comes from, you know that. I'm asking you to stop. That's all I'm asking." Edna was quiet for a moment, Something moved across her face that was not quite what he'd expected. Not defiance. Something more complicated, something that looked, if he was reading it correctly, like a woman who has been wrong about something and is in the early stages of recognizing it. "All right, Eli," she said finally. He nodded and drove home. Garrett told Nora about it 2 days later when he stopped by to return a tool. Eli wasn't there when it happened. He was out checking the south fence. And when he came back in, Nora was at the kitchen window with her coffee. She didn't say anything when he came in, but something had shifted slightly in how she held herself, like a door that had been braced against pressure and had provisionally eased a fraction. Like a person who has been carrying something alone and has just learned they are not quite as alone as they thought. He didn't bring it up. It wasn't the kind of thing that needed to be said between them. He had done it because it was the right thing to do, and she understood that, and that was sufficient. 3 days after that, the real storm came. It didn't announce itself dramatically. It built the way the serious ones always built the sky, going from high white to low gray to a specific flat darkness in the northwest that anyone who'd spent a winter in Montana recognized as something that meant business. Eli had been watching it since mid-morning, and by early afternoon he had done everything on the list of things you did when a blizzard was coming. Extra wood stacked inside, water hauled and stored. The cattle moved to the smaller pasture near the barn. Ropes strung from the back door to the barn door in a single continuous line. He showed Nora the rope that afternoon. "If visibility goes and you need to get to the barn," he started. "Keep my hand on it the whole way," she said. "I know, you told me 2 weeks ago." He looked at her. "I listened," she said. He nodded. "Good." They ate supper with the wind building outside May, talking about whether bears truly slept all winter or simply slept more than usual, and whether you could tell the difference if you were a bear. Neither Eli nor Nora had a definitive answer, and May went to bed unsatisfied on the subject. By 8 o'clock, the visibility was down to 20 yards and falling. The world outside compressed itself into a white chaos that was beautiful in the way that genuinely dangerous things were sometimes beautiful. Eli sat by the window after May was down and went over the morning in his head. What would need doing? In what order? In what conditions? That was when he remembered the bull. He had moved the cattle to the near pasture 3 days ago. But the bull, which he had been keeping separate since it had gotten into a temper the week before, over a fence dispute with one of the younger steers, was still in the north field. A quarter-mile up the grade, no rope line, no shelter between here and there, in the dark, in this storm. He sat with that for a moment and worked through the options, and they were not good options. He stood up and went to get his coat. Nora looked up from the mending she'd been doing. She read his face the way she'd learned to read it over the past weeks, quickly and accurately, and without asking unnecessary questions. "What's wrong?" he told her. He was already pulling on his coat while he said it, stuffing his scarf into the collar, pulling his hat down low. "I'll be back. You can't go alone in this. I've done it before. Eli." She said his name with a weight that stopped him for just a moment. "If your horse spooks in the whiteout, she won't. But if she does, if you go down out there, stay with May," he said. "Don't open the door for anyone unless you hear my voice. You understand me, anyone?" She understood. He saw that she understood not just the instruction, but the layer beneath it. Mercer, the letters, all of it. Her jaw set in the way it set when she had accepted something she couldn't change. He went out. The cold hit him like something solid. The wind had a direction to it that was almost physical, coming hard out of the northwest, taking everything it could carry. Snow and ice crystals, and a temperature that was well below zero and still falling. He got to the barn, got his mare Della saddled, and rode out of the yard into the white. He knew this land in the dark. He'd ridden every foot of it in every kind of weather for 12 years. He kept Della moving at a walk and trusted his memory of the ground, reading the grade beneath him through the saddle, catching the fence line when it briefly appeared through the snow and then vanished again. The visibility was down to almost nothing now. He could see perhaps 10 feet in front of him before the storm erased everything. The wind made it hard to breathe, the kind of cold that turned the air into something wrong, something the lungs resisted. He found the Northfield gate by feel more than sight, got it open and rode through and called for the bull, which was not a thing you did lightly. Bulls didn't come to their names, but sometimes they moved toward the sound. He rode in a widening arc, trying to cover ground without losing his sense of direction. The darkness and the snow made the world identical in every direction. He kept track of where he was by counting strides and maintaining his angle to the wind. He found the bull huddled against the north fence, the wrong corner, as far from the barn as it could get. He got a rope on it without being kicked, which he later considered borderline miraculous, and started the slow, careful work of moving a large and deeply unhappy animal through a blizzard in the dark. Della was doing well. She didn't like it, but she was steady, and she trusted him enough to keep moving. He had the rope looped over the saddle horn, the bull coming sullen and slow behind, and he was turning toward where he believed the gate to be when the footing changed. He felt it before he understood it. Della's stride going wrong, a hesitation, the ground doing something unexpected beneath her. The freeze cycle had heaved a section of the field in a way it hadn't been heaved before, and Della's left foreleg went down into a drop he hadn't anticipated. She was going sideways, and he had a half second to make the choice. He went clear. He was already leaning right as she went, and he pushed off and hit the ground hard on his right shoulder and rolled, and the cold of the frozen earth came up through his coat instantly, absolute cold, the kind that moved inside you before you'd finished registering the impact. The rope pulled out of his hand. He heard the bull lumber away into the dark. Della had gone down on her side. He could hear her, not at the sound of injury, not the scream he dreaded, but the sound of weight and confusion. A horse trying to understand why she was on the ground. He got to her head and talked to her low and continuous, keeping her calm while she worked out what had happened. She was listening to him, and then she began trying to rise, and he moved clear, and she got her legs under her in stages, and she was up. He ran his hands down her legs in the dark, feeling for anything wrong. Found nothing he could identify in these conditions. He stood in the middle of the north field with the storm coming down on him, and the bull gone somewhere in the white, and his shoulder aching in a way that was going to matter more once the cold wore off, and his hands losing dexterity in his gloves. He had lost track of the gate. Visibility was down to 5 feet. His feet were going numb in his boots. He had perhaps 20 minutes before the cold became the kind of problem you didn't come back from. He mounted up because staying on the ground was worse. He pointed Della in the direction he believed the gate to be and let her walk. He kept his eyes ahead and tried not to think about how much of what he was doing right now was operating on hope rather than knowledge. He'd been riding for what felt like 5 minutes, probably 2, when something appeared in the white ahead of him. A light, small and orange and moving, but moving toward him with a purpose that wasn't random. He pulled Della up and stared at it. Then a voice, the wind tearing at it, pulling it apart, called his name. She had the lantern tied to a long length of rope, the other end of which was knotted around her waist, and trailed back in the direction he couldn't see. She was wearing his sheepskin coat, and every piece of warm clothing she appeared to own layered on top of it, and her face was rimed with ice crystals, where the scarf didn't cover. When she reached Della, she grabbed the bridle without ceremony and looked up at him with an expression he had no framework for. "Are you hurt?" she demanded. "Shoulder, I'm fine." He looked at her, at the rope around her waist, at the lantern, at the ice in her hair. "How did you—" "I tied the rope to the porch post and followed your track while I could still see it," she said quickly, factually, like she was reporting what had happened rather than making a case for herself. "Then I took the angle you'd been riding. I've been out here 15 minutes. She was already turning, already moving. "Come on." Della is walking. "Come on, Eli." He came on. She led Della with one hand and held the lantern with the other and kept the rope taut enough to follow, and they came out of the north field and through the yard and into the barn with the storm trying to prevent all of it and failing. She held the lantern while he checked Della's legs properly, a strain on the left foreleg. Nothing that rest wouldn't handle in time, but something that would need watching. Then Nora was pulling at his sleeve. "Inside," she said. "The bull is 1,000 pounds of animal with a coat made for this weather. The bull will survive tonight." She looked at him with a severity that told him she was managing something tightly. "You won't if you stand in this barn much longer." He went inside. She got him through the kitchen and got his coat off him and got the stove built up and sat him down in the chair that had become, over these weeks, his chair. She got his boots off. She found the blanket and the lard and did all of this with the efficiency of someone who has decided that efficiency is how they are going to hold themselves together when other options have expired. She didn't speak until she'd gotten the kettle on and had sat down in the other chair facing him. Then she looked at him. Her face, now that the efficiency had done its job, had something in it that was not the composure. She was pale under the cold redness of her skin, and something around her eyes had the particular tightness of someone who has been frightened and is now past the frightened part, but not yet past what comes right after. "I told you not to go alone," she said. "You did. I meant it. I know you did." She put her hands on her knees and looked at the fire and let out a slow breath that was visible in the still cold air of the kitchen. "Don't do that again." He looked at her. He looked at the rope burn he could see across her palm where she'd been gripping the lantern line. He looked at the ice that was still melting out of her hair. He thought about what it cost a person to tie a rope around their own waist and walk into a whiteout blizzard in December for a man she had known for 6 weeks, a man who had offered her a practical arrangement and a cold house and very few words of welcome. He didn't say any of the things he was thinking. Some things didn't need to be said immediately to be true. "You should let me look at your hand," he said. She looked at it. The rope burn was raw and red across her palm. "It's fine. Let me see it." She let him. He held her hand in both of his, which were finally warming up, and he found the lard in the cloth, and he wrapped her hand the way she had wrapped his fingers 3 weeks ago when she burned them on the stove, and she sat still and let him work. Neither of them said anything while he did it. When he finished, he held her hand a moment longer than the task required. He wasn't entirely conscious of doing it until he realized he was doing it. He let go. He leaned back in his chair. The fire had gotten the kitchen warm now. Outside, the blizzard held everything in its hands and did whatever it wanted with it. Inside the house on the Cormac Ranch, 2 people sat in the warmth they had made and were, for the first time and without any remaining reservation on either side, glad the other one was there. The storm took 2 days to finish with them. For those 2 days, the world outside reduced itself to a white nothing, and the ranch became its own small universe. The kitchen, the main room, the barn twice a day. When Eli made the trip on the rope with Nora, insisting on coming the second morning, and him not arguing because he'd used up his argument credit on the night of the blizzard, and they both knew it. They moved through the confined space of the house and managed not to be in each other's way, which was its own kind of skill. May provided enough noise and motion and questions about the structural integrity of snowdrifts to fill whatever silence might have grown awkward. The shoulder was bad for the first day, a deep bruise and something strained along the top of it that made certain movements sharp enough to stop his breath. He didn't say so. Nora noticed anyway because she noticed things, and she found a way to be in the kitchen when he came back from the barn so she could take whatever he was carrying without making a production of it. He accepted this because it was practical and because he was tired and because the alternative was pretending the shoulder wasn't there, which was less practical than accepting her help. His whole adult life, the alternative to asking for help had been not needing it. He was finding that this approach had a flaw in it that he hadn't examined closely enough before. There was a version of self-sufficiency that was genuinely useful and a version that was just pride wearing the clothes of practicality. He was beginning to understand which version he'd been keeping. On the second evening, when the wind had dropped to something survivable and the snow had thinned from whiteout to merely heavy, he went back out to the north field and found the bull in the corner where the fence met the rise, the most sheltered spot in that pasture. Cold and deeply unhappy, but alive. He got it to the barn by brute stubbornness and a rope and came back inside and stamped the snow off his boots at the door. Nora said without looking up from the stove, "The bull. Barn. Good." She handed him coffee. That was all. And that was somehow exactly enough. On the morning the storm finally cleared, Eli stood in the yard for a moment before starting the work and looked at the ranch under its new weight of snow, the barn, the fence lines, the mountains catching the first thin light. Everything the same as it had been before the storm. Everything slightly different. He thought about what Slocum had said about the trunk being a target. He thought about Mercer somewhere in Coldwater Creek, patient and methodical, gathering his picture of the situation. He thought about a figure at a window in the dark testing a latch. He thought about Brett Ashton in Philadelphia making the calculations of a man who believed money was sufficient to determine outcomes and had not yet been given reason to reconsider. He thought about a woman walking into a whiteout with a rope around her waist and a lantern in her hand. He went back inside and told Nora he was going into town. She didn't argue about going with him. She understood why, and the understanding had cost her something, which she didn't show, but which he recognized. Until they knew where Mercer was and what he was doing, the fewer people who saw her outside the property, the better. She stayed with May. He took the wagon in. He found Slocum in his office above the hardware store and told him about the storm, about Mercer at the general store, about the trunk now in the root cellar, and about the figure at the window 3 nights before. Slocum listened to all of it without interrupting. When it was done, Slocum was quiet for a moment. He tried the window before you moved the trunk, 3 nights after we moved it. He didn't know we'd moved it. So he came away with nothing and doesn't know that. Slocum turned his pen over. That's something. He'll report to Brett that the attempt failed, not that the documents are elsewhere. That buys you time and keeps the trunk's location to yourselves. He leaned back. The wire to Judge Holt has gone out. His clerk acknowledged receipt. Any claim filed against Miss Ashton or her assets in this jurisdiction will require a full hearing before Holt will act on it, and he is not inclined to expedite the process for out-of-state interests. It's not resolution, Slocum said, but it's a wall between her and whatever Brett Ashton tries to file. That's something. Eli nodded. He stood up to leave and then said, one more thing. If Mercer comes onto my property without an invitation. Montana law on trespass is clear, Slocum said, and your right to protect your household is clearer. Eli went home through the snow with that conversation in his chest alongside everything else. The shoulder that still ached when he reached too far, and the memory of a lantern moving toward him through a whiteout, and the particular warmth of a kitchen that was no longer just his. Dade Mercer came to the property on a Tuesday morning in early January when the sky was the particular hard blue that followed a cold snap, and the snow on the ground had compressed itself into a surface like iron. He didn't come in the aggressive way, not with papers, not with force, not with the kind of loud intent that would have been easier to meet. He came up the road on a hired horse at a pace that said he had nowhere urgent to be, tied the animal at the fence post with the unhurried movements of a man making a social call, and walked to the front door and knocked. Eli answered it. He had told Nora that morning when the sound of hoofbeats on the frozen road reached the kitchen that this was probably the day. She had looked at him once and then taken May to the back of the house without being asked. They had talked through how this would go. She trusted him to handle it, which was not a small thing from a woman who had spent the better part of a year trusting no one with anything that mattered. Mercer looked different without the general store backdrop. He'd traded the town clothes for something more practical, a heavy coat, working boots, a hat pulled down against the cold. He looked standing on the porch in the January light like a man who had made peace with difficult conditions, which Eli supposed he had. Mr. Cormack, Mercer had dropped the easy sociability from the general store. He was direct now, which paradoxically Eli respected more than the performance of 3 weeks ago. I think we can both stop pretending I'm in the market for land. I was never pretending, Eli said. I knew what you were at the general store. A slight acknowledgement moved across Mercer's face. I represent certain interests in Philadelphia who are concerned about the welfare of a family member who traveled west without informing them. They want to know she's safe. If she is, I can confirm that and be on my way. My employers don't want trouble. They want to know where Miss Ashton is, Eli said, so they can send the paperwork. Something shifted in Mercer's expression. Not guilt exactly, but the acknowledgement that the pretense had a limit and they'd reached it. There are legal matters outstanding, he said, related to the estate. Her presence is required. Her presence is not required anywhere she doesn't choose to go. Eli kept his voice even, not aggressive, simply factual. She's a free adult woman. She lives here. Any legal matter that concerns her can come through the court in Billings where her attorney will answer it. If your employers have a claim they believe is valid, they're welcome to file it there and have it examined by a judge who is already familiar with the situation. That landed. He saw it land, the slight contraction around Mercer's eyes. That meant the situation had moved faster than he'd anticipated. Judge Aldous Holt, Eli said. I sent the wire 3 weeks ago. His clerk acknowledged it the following day. Mercer was quiet for a moment. He was reading Eli the way Eli was reading him, taking stock, calculating, deciding what the actual landscape looked like versus what he'd been told to expect. My employer's attorney may wish to. Their attorney can contact Thaddeus Slocum in Coldwater Creek. His office is above the hardware store. Eli looked at Mercer steadily. Is there anything else? Another moment. Mercer looked at the house, a long, unhurried look that was doing inventory cataloging what he could see through the door and the windows. Then he looked back at Eli. She's in there, he said. Not quite a question. This is private property, Eli said. You're welcome to turn your horse around. Mercer held his gaze for a count of 5. Then he said, tell her that Brett Ashton's patience is not unlimited. Tell Brett Ashton, Eli said, that Montana has very clear laws about trespassing, and that the next time someone tries a window on my property at 2 in the morning, I'll consider it a threat and respond accordingly. The color changed slightly in Mercer's face. He hadn't known that Eli knew about the window. The information cost him something, the composed professional certainty that he'd been operating with, and Eli watched it cost him. Mercer turned around. He untied the horse and rode back down the road at the same unhurried pace he'd arrived, with the deliberate movement of a man demonstrating that he wasn't retreating even when he was. Eli stood on the porch until the horse disappeared around the tree line. Then he went inside and closed the door. Nora was in the kitchen doorway. She'd heard most of it, the walls were not thick, and she'd been close enough to hear what mattered. She was holding May's hand, and her face had the specific expression of someone who has been waiting a long time to find out whether something they feared was going to materialize, and has now received an answer that is not resolution, but is something, a breathing space, a door not yet open, a winter morning where the storm hasn't come. Is he gone? She asked. For now. Eli came inside and hung up his coat. He won't stop at one visit. Brett will push harder once Mercer reports back. I know. That's why Slocum is filing with Holt tomorrow morning. We get the documentation in front of a judge who already knows your side of it before Brett can get his version there. Holt doesn't like being outmaneuvered. He especially doesn't like men from back east who assume their money extends past the Missouri River. She looked at him for a moment. You've thought about all of this very carefully. I've had time. You didn't have to. He looked back at her. I know I didn't. May, who had been watching this exchange with the focused attention of a child reading the room, and understanding that something significant had happened without knowing precisely what said, Is everything all right? Nora looked down at her and squeezed her hand. Yes, she said, and then in a voice that had something certain in it that hadn't been there 2 months ago, something that sounded like a decision being made rather than a comfort being offered. Yes, it is. She meant it. Eli could see that she meant it not as reassurance for the child, but as a real thing she had decided was true. He could see the exact moment she let herself believe it stopped holding the exit door open in the back of her mind. He turned to hang his coat so she wouldn't see his face. The wire from Philadelphia came on a Thursday in the 3rd week of January. Slocum brought it out himself, which had become his way with communications that mattered. He arrived at the ranch in late morning, and Nora came to the kitchen table when Eli called her, and Slocum spread his notes out and went through it methodically the way he did everything. Pemberton Graves had moved quickly once he'd received the wire confirming Mercer's presence in Montana. He had filed in a Philadelphia court the previous week presenting the original will and the supporting correspondence as evidence against the forged document. The filing had triggered an examination of both documents and both sets of witnesses. The first of Warren Ashton's witnesses had already been interviewed. His testimony had been in Graves's careful language unhelpful to Warren's position. More importantly, and Slocum read this part slowly, giving it the weight it deserved, Graves had also filed a preemptive notice with the Montana Territorial Court System through Billings establishing Nora's legal standing and contesting any claim an out-of-territory party might attempt to file against her or her property. Judge Holt had received it. Slocum had spoken with Holt's clerk that same morning. Holt will not accept any claim against Miss Ashton or her assets in this jurisdiction without a full hearing, Slocum said. Given the existing filing from Philadelphia, any attempt by the Ashton family to seize documents or compel her return would require going through his court. And he is not inclined to expedite that process for out-of-state interests. He looked at Nora over his notes. In plain language, they cannot take the trunk. They cannot force you anywhere. Whatever they try legally has to go through a judge who already knows the situation from your side. Nora had been still through all of this in the way she went still for important things. Now she asked how long before the Philadelphia case resolves. Graves estimates 6 months, possibly less if the second witness cooperates the way the first one has. Brett may try to delay, he has reasons to, but the longer this goes, the more carefully the forged document gets examined, and that examination does not favor him. Slocum paused. You're not in the clear. There will still be maneuvers. Brett Ashton isn't a man who accepts a situation while he can still fight it. But you are in a defensible position. That's different from where you were 2 months ago. After Slocum left, they sat at the kitchen table, Eli and Nora, in the quiet of a house where May was napping, and the fire was good, and the world outside was frozen and white and entirely still. 2 months ago, Nora said eventually. She said it the way you measure a distance you've traveled without fully registering each step. I sat in a train car with that trunk in the luggage car and a name that wasn't mine, and I tried to figure out what I was willing to give up. She looked at the table. I thought I was willing to disappear entirely, to become whoever this was going to require me to be, to let go of everything I'd been before and just start from nothing. Eli listened. I didn't, she said. Give it up. I'm not sure when that happened. Somewhere between the firewood and the blizzard, I think. He looked at her across the table. The light in the kitchen was the particular gray-white of January in Montana, flat and honest, and in it, she looked like exactly what she was. Tired and real and nothing like the woman he'd watched descend from that train. Or rather, like a version of that woman that had shed everything that wasn't essential until what remained was the actual substance of her. The trunk, he said. What happens to it after? She thought about it. When the estate is settled, Graves thinks there's a possibility of a settlement with Warren. He doesn't want a public fight any more than I do. If we can find an arrangement that preserves what my father actually intended while giving Warren a way to step back without complete humiliation. She paused. The documents might go to lawyers and courts and safe deposit boxes, and then the trunk is just a very heavy piece of furniture. He looked at the wall between the kitchen and the main room. I was thinking, he said, it might make a good bench. She looked at him. A bench. In the main room, it's the right height, sturdy. Those iron fittings would last another 50 years. May could use it for reading. There's a spot below the window that gets the afternoon light. Nora was quiet for a moment. Something changed in her expression. Not dramatically, not the sudden release of emotion, but a slow shift. The way light changes on a hillside when a cloud moves and the sun reaches what was in shadow. She looked at the main room and then at her hands and then at him. A bench, she said again, softer this time. If you wanted. She looked at the main room for a long moment. Yes, she said. I think I'd like that. He nodded. He got up and refilled his coffee, and when he turned back, she was still looking at the main room with an expression he had been watching change and develop for 2 months and could now finally name clearly. She looked like someone who had arrived somewhere, not the place she'd planned, not the destination she'd written on any list. But somewhere she recognized something in her responding to the particular quality of this specific life. This kitchen, this cold, this man and his daughter and his ill-tempered cow and his wind-battered ranch at 4,000 feet in the Montana Territory. She looked like someone who had stopped running. He set his coffee down. Nora, he said. She looked at him. He didn't have a long speech. He had never had long speeches in him for things that mattered. What he had was the truth stated plainly, which had always seemed to him like the most honest form of respect one person could offer another. Stay, he said. Just the one word, not a question exactly, but not a command. A request made plain without decoration, without the cushioning that people sometimes use to protect themselves from the directness of what they were actually asking. She looked at him for a long moment. The January light came through the kitchen window. The fire settled. Somewhere down the hall, May was beginning to make the small sounds of a child about to wake from a nap, the soft, restless movement that came before full waking, before the question started. I already am, Nora said. Those 2 words sat in him differently than he'd expected. Not like the closing of something, but like the first morning after a long illness, when you wake and the pain is gone, and you lie there for a moment, not quite believing the absence of it. Something had been carrying weight in him for a long time, longer than he'd been honest with himself about, and now it was lighter, and the lightness itself was something he had to get accustomed to. He didn't make a production of it. That wasn't how he was built. He went back to the work the next morning, and the morning after that, and the work was what it had always been, cold and physical and without sentiment. But something in the texture of it had changed. There was someone in the kitchen when he came in from the barn. There was a lamp in the window when he came back after dark. There was coffee already made and a child's voice in the next room, and the particular sound of a house that knew it had enough people in it. These were small things. He had learned that winter not to underestimate small things. January settled in with the hard, pressing cold that was different from the storms, not violent but relentless. The kind that came down from the north and simply sat on the land for days at a time and didn't move. The thermometer on the barn door read temperatures that condensed his breath into clouds that hung in the still air before dissolving. The days were so short, they barely seemed to happen. You did the morning work in the dark. You did the evening work in the dark. The light in between was a thin gray allowance that you used completely and without waste. Nora used it. By January, she was doing things he hadn't asked her to do because she had seen they needed doing. She reinforced the chicken coop insulation that he had been meaning to address since November, working at it methodically over 3 cold afternoons with materials she'd identified in the supply shed. She tracked the feed inventory with a precision that saved them 2 unnecessary trips to town in the worst weather. She found the gaps in the household rhythm and filled them without announcement. And she was teaching May to read, which was something Eli had been attempting for 6 months with limited success. He'd come in one afternoon and found them at the kitchen table, May sounding out words from an old almanac with her tongue between her teeth and her whole body concentrated on the task, and Nora sitting beside her in complete silence when May got a word right, just waiting for the next one. He stood in the doorway and watched for a while without either of them noticing. That evening, he asked her how she'd known to do it that way. "She hates being patronized," Nora said simply. "Praise tells her you expected her to fail. Waiting tells her you expected her to succeed." He thought about that for a long time afterward. He thought about all the ways he'd been managing things since Catherine died, doing them correctly, doing them consistently, but alone, working within the dimensions of his own understanding of what was needed. And how different some of those dimensions looked now that there was someone else in the house who saw things he hadn't seen and knew things he hadn't thought to know. Parenting, it turned out, was something 2 people could do better than one. He hadn't expected that. He'd thought he had the essential shape of it handled. And the shape was right. But there were depths to it he'd been navigating by memory and instinct alone that he hadn't known were being navigated that way until they weren't. He asked her to marry him in February in the barn. He was resetting a thrown shoe on Della. She'd lost one on the ice that morning, a piece of bad luck in a month that had been short on good luck and long on cold, and Nora was handing him things. The conversation had wandered through several practical topics before he said, without any particular preamble and without looking up from the hoof he was working on, "I think we should get married." She had been in the middle of handing him a cloth. She stopped. "Because of the legal situation," she said. "No." He kept his attention on the work because this was easier to say without looking directly at her. "The legal situation is nearly handled. Slocum says Holt has everything he needs." "Then why?" He looked at her then. "Because I can't imagine this place without you in it anymore," he said. "And I'm not interested in trying." She held the cloth. She was quiet in the way she was quiet when she was deciding something real. Not stalling, not performing consideration, but actually working through it completely before she committed to an answer. He waited because she had always deserved the time she took. "That's not very romantic," she said at last. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She held the cloth a moment longer. Then she set it on the stall door and said, "Yes." "All right?" "Yes." So it was that kind of proposal, and it suited them both exactly. They married in March when the snow on the south-facing slopes had gone gray and heavy at the edges, in the way that meant it was thinking about leaving. Not gone yet, not warm yet, but the land beginning to consider the possibility of another season. Judge Aldous Holt rode out from Billings for the occasion, which was not something he was required to do, and which told Eli something about the man he'd already suspected. Thaddeus Slocum served as witness. Edna and Garrett Briggs came Garrett looking solidly pleased, Edna wearing the particular expression of a woman who has been wrong about something and is in the deliberate, slightly uncomfortable process of making her peace with it. They stood on the porch of the Cormac Ranch with the mountains white against a cold blue sky and said the words. It was not a long ceremony, and it was not a showy one, and it did not need to be either of those things. What it was true, two people standing in the cold in front of a judge and a lawyer and a neighboring family and saying plainly what was already the case, which was that they had decided to make a life together in this particular place, in this particular climate, with this particular work, and that the decision was permanent. May stood beside Nora for the entire ceremony, holding her hand with both of hers, as though she'd been assigned to this position and took the assignment seriously. She was wearing her good coat and her red scarf and her best boots, which she had cleaned herself the night before without being asked, and she had the expression of a child who understands that something important is happening and intends to be completely present for it. When it was done, when Judge Holt had said what needed to be said, and the small group on the porch had gone quiet in the way that follows something that matters, May looked up at Nora. She had been thinking about what she wanted to say. That was clear from the deliberateness with which she said it, having chosen the moment, having decided on the words. "Can I call you Mama?" she asked. The March wind moved across the porch. Nora looked down at this child who had run toward her at the bottom of a wagon step on a November afternoon, as though she'd been expecting her, who had led her through the front door of an unfamiliar house, as though it already belonged to both of them, who had told her with complete 5-year-old conviction that what gets mended with love grows stronger than it was before. "Yes," Nora said. "You can." She said it clearly without hesitation, and the word had weight in her mouth, the weight of everything it asked of a person, the permanence of it, the daily and difficult and entirely specific reality of what it meant to be a mother to a child who was watching you with dark eyes and complete trust. She knew what it meant. She said it anyway. That was the thing about her. Eli thought the thing that had been true since the first morning she'd looked Bessie in the eye and refused to back down. She didn't say things she didn't mean, and she didn't flinch from things that meant something large. Edna Briggs cried, which surprised everyone on the porch, including Edna. The settlement with Warren Ashton was finalized in April. Graves sent the documents to Slocum with a cover letter that was professional and precise and contained at the very end a single line that said nothing about law or money or the mechanics of the agreement. "Your father would have been proud of how you handled this." Nora read that line standing at the kitchen table. She read it twice. Then she set the letter down carefully and went outside. She was gone for a while. Eli was in the barn when she came back through the yard, and he watched her walk across the frozen mud with her head down and her hands in her coat pockets. He didn't call to her. He didn't ask. There were things a person needed to carry by themselves for a little while, and the job of the people who loved them was simply to be there when they came back in. She came into the barn and stood next to him at Della's stall and looked at the horse for a moment without saying anything. "It's done," she said. "Yes." She was quiet. "Then he would have liked you." Eli thought about a man he'd never met who had raised a daughter with enough spine to walk into a blizzard with a rope around her waist, and enough character to stitch a torn doll with the best thread she owned. "I think I would have liked him," he said. She nodded. She reached out and ran her hand along Della's nose, the gesture of someone who needed something solid and warm to touch. Then she went back inside. He stayed in the barn for a few more minutes and let her have the kitchen to herself. Mercer had left Coldwater Creek the week before the settlement came through. He went the way he'd come, quietly without announcement. The station manager mentioned that a man matching his description had boarded an eastbound train on a Wednesday morning, and that was the last anyone in Coldwater Creek saw of him. Garrett Briggs heard about it from Ben Aldrich at the general store and told Eli with a look of satisfaction he didn't try to conceal. Eli nodded and didn't say much, which was the right amount. The wire from Graves came in the third week of April, a follow-up to the settlement documents with one additional piece of information that Slocum brought out himself because he decided it merited the trip. The second of Warren Ashton's witnesses, a man named Corvin, who had been in Warren's employ for 4 years, had provided a full written statement to the Philadelphia court. Not because anyone had compelled him to, because he had made the private calculation that the losing side of a documented fraud case was a considerably worse place to be than a cooperating witness who came forward before the sentencing phase. Corvin had described in precise detail the circumstances under which the forged document had been created. Edmund Ashton had not signed the amended will. He had been presented with a different document, a routine business authorization, and had signed that. His signature had then been transferred to the fraudulent will amendment by a process Corvin described with the specificity of someone who had been present for all of it. Warren had been in the room. Brett had coordinated the practical elements. "That's fraud," Slocum said, setting down the wire summary at the kitchen table. "Not arguable fraud. Documented, witnessed with a cooperating party who was there for the entire thing." Warren's attorney had already approached Graves about a settlement before the second statement was submitted. They wanted to avoid criminal prosecution. The terms Nora had laid out months ago, no charges filed in exchange for Warren's complete withdrawal from the estate, a signed statement confirming the amendment was fraudulent for the permanent record, and a formal reinstatement of the original will had been accepted without significant negotiation. Brett had accepted the same terms 3 days later. Nora sat at the kitchen table and read through Slocum's summary with the careful attention she gave to things that mattered. She read it twice. Then she put it down and looked at the window where the April light was coming through at the angle that meant the days were lengthening again. The afternoons arriving later and fuller, the country beginning to remember what it looked like when it wasn't frozen. "It's done," Slocum said. "Almost," Nora said. "Settlements take time to finalize." "The direction is set," Slocum said. "That's what matters now." After Slocum left, Eli crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her and put his hands on her shoulders, not pulling her toward him. Just his hands there, steady and present, the way you put your hand on something you want to stay. She looked up at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything because they had both separately and together run out of words for what this moment was. The relief that had been building since November was here now fully arrived, and it was not the dramatic thing she might have imagined in the train car 8 months ago. It was quieter than that, more ordinary, more real. Then May came in from the hall in her socks, wanting to know what was for supper, and the moment became a different kind of moment, which was the way of things in a house with a 5-year-old in it. And that was all right, too. Spring came to Montana the way it always did, slowly and without promises. A warm day followed by a cold week. Mud and ice sharing the yard with a mutual antagonism that made every trip to the barn an exercise in paying attention. The snow went off the south-facing slopes first, as it always did, and the creek came up hard with a runoff, and the cattle moved with the new grass as it appeared, and the ranch took on the particular energy of a place waking up after a long suspension. Everything that had been held in place by cold now resuming its motion. Nora saw spring in Montana for the first time, and she watched it with the same complete attention she'd given to everything else out here. Not romantically, not the way someone from a city imagines frontier spring as a sudden and picturesque relief, but practically reading what it meant in terms of work and weather and the changed demands of the season ahead. She asked questions, she learned things, she made mistakes in the mud season that she didn't make twice. She was learning the shape of this place the way a person learns a place they intend to keep. She had run away from one life and found another, and the second one was harder in every physical sense and truer in every way that mattered. She had not seen that coming. She was grateful for it in the way you were grateful for things that changed you without your permission. The things that turned out to have been exactly what you needed, even though you never would have chosen them if the choice had been offered cleanly. In May, they brought the trunk up from the root cellar. Eli carried it himself, his shoulder fully healed by then the winter's damage resolved by the same gradual process that healed most things, and set it in the main room. They stood and looked at it for a moment. This object that had traveled 3,000 miles from Philadelphia, carrying fear and documentation and hidden gold, and the entirety of one woman's attempt to preserve what her father had meant to leave her. It looked different now, sitting in the afternoon light of the main room. It looked like what it was, a very large, very well-made piece of furniture that had done the job It was built to do and was now ready for something else. Still think it would make a good bench, Eli said. I know a carpenter in town, Nora said. He could fit a top, something flat, maybe a cushion. A cushion might be pushing it. A cushion, she said with the particular firmness of a woman who has navigated a blizzard and a lawsuit and a figure at a window in the dark and an ill-tempered cow and has thoroughly earned the right to make definitive statements about upholstery. He looked at her. She looked back with the expression that had replaced the composed mask, something warmer and more specific. The expression of a woman who knew exactly what she wanted and was not remotely apologetic about it. Fine, he said, a cushion. The carpenter came out from town the following week and worked the iron-banded trunk into a bench with a fitted lid that opened for storage and a cushion covered in dark wool that Nora had chosen from what was available at the general store, which was not much but was sufficient. It sat in the main room against the wall below the window, and May immediately claimed it as her preferred reading spot, and it fit there as though it had always been there, which in the way that mattered, Eli supposed it had. He thought sometimes about what it still held inside it. The framework of the thing, the iron and the dark wood, the weight of it still spoke of what it had been. The locked container, the hidden life, the object that four men had cursed and strained to move on a November platform while a woman watched with composed eyes and gave nothing away. But the lid opened easily now. There was nothing inside that needed to be hidden. May kept her smooth stones in it, and her collection of bird feathers, and 2 spare scarves she'd outgrown but couldn't bring herself to give up, and the cloth doll with the golden thread at its seam which sat on top of everything else, as though presiding a small authority over the contents, certain of its place. What gets mended with love grows stronger than it was before. He had heard Nora say that to May on a November night with a snow-covered ranch outside, in a fear she was carrying alone, and he had stood in his kitchen and not known yet what to make of the woman in his house. He knew now. He knew the full inventory of her, the stubbornness and the competence, the particular pride that made her go back to Bessie the cow after being kicked rather than concede the point. The way she cried quietly and went outside rather than making anyone witness it. The laugh she had that she didn't deploy often, but that when it came was completely unguarded, nothing held back. The way she looked at May when May wasn't looking. The way she had walked into a whiteout blizzard with a rope around her waist and a lantern in her hand for a man she had known 6 weeks. He knew her the way you knew someone you had survived something with. That was its own kind of knowing, different from the knowing that came from time alone, or proximity alone, or the ordinary accumulations of a shared life. It was the knowing that came from having seen a person at the exact moment when there was no more pretense possible. When everything they were was right there on the surface, either sufficient for what was needed or not. She had been sufficient. She had been more than sufficient. He was aware in the way that honest people were aware of the gap between what he had planned and what he had gotten. His letter to the Caldwell Matrimonial Agency had asked for a practical woman capable of surviving brutal winters. He had been practical about it, or thought he had been putting down what was needed, omitting what seemed irrelevant, approaching the whole enterprise as a problem in logistics. He had gotten something else entirely, not something worse, something larger than what he'd asked for, or more precisely, something that answered questions he hadn't known he was asking. A woman who had sat across from him at a kitchen table in November and told him the truth without being asked to. Who had stayed when she could have gone? Who had turned an iron-banded trunk full of fear into a bench where his daughter kept her stones and her feathers and her repaired doll with the golden seam? He didn't believe in luck. He believed in work and weather and the mathematics of preparation and the value of showing up every morning regardless of conditions. But standing in the doorway of the main room on a May evening, with the last of the afternoon light coming through the window and falling across the bench and across May with her book, and across Nora's dark head bent over the mending she'd brought in from outside, he thought there might be a third category beyond work and weather and preparation. The things that happened to you that you could not have planned for, that arrived on their own terms and didn't ask your permission. That turned out to be the things that made the rest of it make sense. He had written a letter one September night because he couldn't bear the silence in his daughter's room. He had stood in the cold on a November platform waiting to regret it. He had watched a woman scan the platform in both directions before descending from a train, and he had known even then that whatever had brought her here was not the thing she'd written in any letter. None of it was what he had planned. All of it was what he had needed. Nora looked up from her mending and found him in the doorway. "You're letting the evening air in," she said. "Sorry," he said. He came inside and closed the door. He sat down in his chair. She went back to the mending. May turned a page, entirely absorbed, her feet tucked up beneath her on the bench that had once been a trunk that had crossed half a continent, carrying the weight of everything a person was afraid to lose. Outside, the mountains held the last of the day's light on their high faces, still snow-covered up above the timberline, the white going gold, and then rose and then a fading gray as the sun finished its work. And then they let it go, the way mountains let things go, without urgency, without regret. The ranch went dark the way it always had and always would, settling into the particular quiet of a May evening when the cold had finally eased its grip and the country was remembering how to breathe. The kind of evening that didn't require anything from the people in it except to be present in it. And the people inside the Cormac Ranch stayed warm.